Existing in the diet culture that we exist in, it's hard to avoid conversations around whether or not food is addictive. It comes up inevitably often throughout the years, and I've seen it over and over again, people saying and claiming that food is addictive and you need to restrict certain foods because of it, because it's just like a drug. But the reality is it's a lot more complicated than that. And I want to talk about why it's more complicated than that to hopefully provide you some felt sense of relief around food addiction. When I see this conversation happen out in the world, whether it's on a TED Talk or on social media or some other platform, there's a lot of fear-mongering involved in the conversation around food addiction, comparisons to drugs and comparisons to natural events and comparison to disease. And I find that it often leaves people feeling really hopeless, feeling like they need to exclude tons of foods and food groups because food is addictive, or at least that's what we're told. So my hope in sharing some information about food addiction with you is that it provides some felt sense of relief. I'm often afraid when I start talking about food addiction that somehow I would exclude you or make you feel like your experience isn't valid. But it really is. What you're experiencing is super valid. If you feel out of control around food, that is super valid. Everything you're experiencing is real. It's just that likely what you've been told about food addiction isn't quite the whole story. I remember when I too used to feel addicted to food, and when people would tell me all the research and data behind food addiction, it would really affirm and confirm my experience, and that felt really good. So if you're in that place right now and you're feeling like, well, I do feel addicted and everything that they're saying feels true and I'm having success around cutting out foods, just take a deep breath, make yourself a cup of tea, and maybe make a little space for there being some other possibilities around food that actually might be more helpful for you long term. If you don't already know me, my name is Catherine Metzelaar. I'm a dietitian and I help people to create peace with food and their bodies so it frees up time, headspace, and they can live the life that they truly want to be living. You definitely want to take a listen to this. So let's talk about food addiction. There's a lot of research around food addiction, a lot of things that are taken from that research, and then articles are written about the research. And honestly, the articles that usually come out make people feel pretty confused about the research around food addiction. I've seen certain articles, and you may have too, about Oreos being as addictive as cocaine and sugar being as addictive as drugs. And you read these things and instantly you feel pretty afraid. Gosh, if I'm eating something that's equivalent to drugs, or if I'm giving my kids something that's equivalent, then I'm doing something wrong and I need to stop that immediately. And of course you're feeling afraid. A lot of this information that you see or read says that sugar lights up the same part of the brain that drugs do, and foods are really designed to make you addicted to them, and they're hyper palatable, and therefore you should be avoiding these kinds of foods so that you're not addicted to them. And if you feel out of control around foods, then that's gonna just intuitively make a lot of sense. But the reality is there's a big thing missing there. So let's get into it. When we're talking about food addiction research, what's often missing from the conversation is one, these studies are done on rats. The second thing is when they show brain studies and they're showing different parts of the brain lighting up in rodents, for example, what they're showing is the pleasure center of the brain lighting up when we get a hit of dopamine. So you could compare multiple brain scans next to one another. One, someone eating sugar, one, somebody doing drugs, one, someone hugging someone for 20 minutes, one, someone eating chocolate, one, someone cooing at their baby, and you'd see all the same centers of the brain lighting up. The third thing is the research around food addiction doesn't really have a standard. They haven't come up with an agreed upon definition of what food addiction exactly is. So why does that matter? What that means is that somebody could be saying that food is addictive based on the evidence that they have, and then somebody else could be saying it's addictive based on the evidence that they have, and there isn't any kind of agreement amongst researchers. And the fourth really important piece of all of this in food addiction research that I really, really want to emphasize is that it's not controlled for disordered eating and eating disorders. And not controlled means that they're not measuring it in the context of the research. Why does this matter? Why are we wanting that to be part of it? Because we know that restriction of certain foods, of foods in general, makes food more interesting to the body and the brain, makes us feel a greater amount of dopamine when we finally do end up eating it, makes us feel out of control and kind of crazed around certain foods. And so we're really missing a huge part of the research if we are not controlling for and including questions, analyses of people that are experiencing disordered eating and eating disorders in the context of food addiction research. And the fifth thing I want you to consider is that food is not the same as drugs. We need food to live and to survive and to be human, essentially. We do not need drugs in order to do that. So it's not really a fair comparison because they're different things, right? One can go to rehab and quit drugs and completely cut them out. One cannot go to rehab for food and completely cut foods out because of what ends up happening to the body when we're restricting. And we've got tons of research to support that, including, of course, but not limited to, research in the field of eating disorders of what happens when we restrict our food. But that applies to everybody else. We feel out of control around food when we restrict it. We feel like we can't stop eating it, right? So let us consider that. I want to take a moment again, if you've reached this point in the video, to remind you that this is not an invalidation of your experience. This is simply talking about the nuances and specifically the things that are missing around the discussion of food addiction. But this doesn't mean that your experience isn't valid and real. There's plenty of people, for example, that go to Overeaters Anonymous and feel really affirmed because they have felt out of control around food. They say that food is an addictive substance. They cut foods out. It feels good until it doesn't. And then you feel out of control around it and feel a lot of shame. So that's not what we are going to do. That's not what I am here to do. My whole intention is to help you to feel more empowered to make some decisions about what you want to do with this information. So if you feel addicted to foods and you felt validated by some of the research that's been presented to you, even though we now know that it's missing a lot and doesn't actually tell the whole story, and it's in mice, and even when it's in mice, it doesn't mean it was a good study, and what do you do with this information? Where do you go from here if you're feeling out of control with food and you're feeling like you are addicted to foods? There's three things that I want to offer you to consider as a way to lessen the feeling of being addicted to food. The first thing that I want you to consider is what happens in the context of when we're not getting enough carbohydrates. And I say carbohydrates specifically because this is a really common food and food group that people tend to restrict because we exist during a time right now where carbohydrates are demonized, and by an extension, sweet foods are demonized. They fall under the category of carbohydrates. When our body doesn't get carbohydrates, it does not like that. And there are systems and mechanisms in place that make sure that, one, you think about carbs more when you're restricting them, and when you finally do eat them, you eat quite a bit of them. Not to mention your glucose levels can be impacted by not having enough carbohydrates. And so consider, if you're restricting carbohydrates because you feel out of control around them, you likely are going to experience even more carbohydrate cravings when you restrict the food even more, right? Because under the lens of addiction, it's saying that these foods are addictive, so you need to cut them out. And what happens? You cut them out and you feel even more out of control around them. So consider how much you're restricting carbs or sweet foods. And the next step would be to actually start including more of them. Now, that's a huge step and maybe not something that you're ready for. But a first step is to take a really hard look at ways in which you might be restricting carbohydrates that could be contributing to your felt sense of being out of control around food. I know I used to feel that way. I used to restrict carbohydrates pretty heavily because I believed before I became a dietitian that they were bad for me, and I listened to everything that I saw and read on Google. And what happened when I would finally eat carbs? I'd feel out of have control around them. And then I was like, oh, you see, this is because it's the carbohydrate. This is because it's the chips. This is because it's bad food. When in reality, it wasn't because of that. It was because I was restricting and my body and brain didn't know when it would have it again. Not to mention it needed the extra carbs in that moment. The second thing that I want you to consider, and this might be one that you haven't thought about yet, it's a question, but give it a go. If you weren't addicted to food in the way that you feel and describe, what would be left? If you were no longer labeling yourself as addicted to food or labeling that you were addicted to a certain kind of food, what would be left in its absence? How would you describe your experience with food? Would you feel like there's something wrong with you? Would you start to feel shame? Would you feel like you're doing something wrong by eating them? That would be guilt. By removing the title of being addicted to food, we're often able to access other things that are going on that the label of food addiction kind of distracts us from. So likely, once you remove the title of being a food addict or being addicted to food, there's probably a lot there. You have experienced a whole lifetime of food experiences up until this moment. And when you remove the label of food addiction, you're able to access all the other things that are going on for you. And that is so beneficial when we talk about healing your relationship with food, because we need to understand more about what's happening. And by labeling it as food addiction, we can't really access it, right? We just say, oh, well, it's the food's fault and we need to cut out those foods and done and done. But that actually doesn't work long term. And even people that try to do that for an extended period of time can't really sustain it, and it ends up creating a lot of disordered eating patterns as a result. And the third thing that I want to offer has two parts to it. So when you eat something that brings you joy, you get a hit of dopamine. And a lot of times addiction research shows this, right, in the brain scans and says, well, it's equal to doing drugs. That is not true. It's not an equivalent. We're just seeing that you are getting a source of joy, of pleasure in that moment from the food itself. So here's a couple things I want you to consider. As the third point, one, normalize that experience. It is okay that you feel joy and pleasure from having foods. We exist in a dieting culture that tells us constantly that really food should not be enjoyable. And if it is, it means that you're doing something wrong. When in reality, that's not true at all. Food is meant to be joyful and pleasurable and to be something that you're looking forward to. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. So first we want to normalize that it's okay for you to feel pleasure and joy and get a hit of dopamine when you have food. And the second part of that dopamine piece is I also want you to consider other ways that you experience joy and pleasure in your life. It's important that we're looking at the ways that we're restricting and how that impacts our relationship with food. And we're looking at the flaws in addiction research, and we're taking steps to healing our relationship with food. Alongside of that, we also want to take a look at and get curious about other ways that we experience joy and pleasure in our life. It is not uncommon that if we don't have other sources of joy and pleasure, that we'll want to seek more of it. This doesn't mean, though, that we will constantly be eating or seeking pleasure from food. It just means that it can be helpful to take a look at and make a list of all the other things that we feel joy and pleasure from. I'm often cautious about saying that second point because there's a lot of nuance here. So what I'm not saying is if you don't have other sources of pleasure, joy in your life, that you will then funnel that into food. It doesn't always work out exactly in that way. It's simply an offering to kind of widen the lens here and think about other things that bring you joy and pleasure that aren't just food. But we want to include food too, right? We're not excluding food. We're just working towards, are there other sources of joy and pleasure in our life, so that once we start including more foods in, once we get rid of the restriction, and if we're still finding ourselves going to food, then it might be something for us to consider. Are there other sources of joy and pleasure that I am wanting and needing in this moment that I can access? So in summary, there's a lot of flaws in addiction research. It's done mostly on rodents. The information is often extrapolated and presented as being very clear and very factual, but there just really isn't much research yet to support food addiction in humans. And the most important part that I want you to take away is that none of the research that currently exists controls in humans, controls for disordered eating and eating disorders, which is really huge because of what we know happens in the context of food restriction, how behaviors change, how obsessed we get with food, how out of control we feel around food. And that can look like addiction behaviors or mimic addiction behaviors with drugs, but it's not the same, and they go away after we start including a variety of foods back into our diet. I hope that you'll consider some of the things that I offered as a way to begin to, one, always get curious about what's happening for you and really consider some of the things that might be impacting your felt sense of being addicted to foods and feeling out of control around foods. I want you to know more than anything. I know this on a deep level for myself, and I want you to know this too, that this is not your fault. It's not a character default. You're not doing anything wrong if you feel out of control around food or addicted to food. It is much more complex than that. And so I want you to feel empowered to take some of this information to start untangling it, right? Because sometimes it's hard to access and understand everything that's going on, especially when we slap a label of food addiction onto it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it was helpful. If it was, give it a like below, and I hope to see you back here soon.